Okay, Chapter 15, Factors Affecting Physiological Function, the Environment, and Special Aids to Performance. Objectives. Explain the statement, the hypothalamus plays the most important role in regulating thermal balance. Name 4 physiological factors that contribute to heat exchange during rest and exercise. Describe how circulatory system serves as a workhorse for thermal regulation. List desirable clothing characteristics for use during exercise in cold and warm weather. Describe how cardiac output, heart rate, stroke volume respond during submaximal and maximal exercise with the environmental heat stress. Describe circulatory adjustments that maintain blood pressure during hot weather exercise. Quantify fluid loss during hot weather exercise. Identify physiological consequences of dehydration. Explain how acclimatization, training, age, gender, body fat modify heat tolerance during exercise. Identify factors that compromise heat stress index. Explain the purpose of the wind chill index. Describe physiological adjustments to cold stress. Outline effects of increasingly higher altitudes on partial pressure of oxygen in ambient air, saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen in pulmonary capillaries, and VO2 max. And describe the immediate and long-term physiological adjustments to altitude exposure. Outline 3 approaches for creating an altitude environment at sea level so an athlete can spend sufficient time to stimulate an acclimatization response. Describe the typical time course for red blood cell reinfusion and mechanism for its ergogenic effects on endurance performance and aerobic capacity. Discuss the medical use of erythropoietin and its potential dangers for healthy athletes. Contrast general warm-up and specific warm-up. Identify potential cardiovascular benefits of moderate warm-up immediately prior to extreme physical effort. So before the extreme physical effort. Provide a rationale for breathing a hyperoxic gas mixture to enhance exercise performance and quantify its potential to increase tissue oxygen availability. What is thermoregulation? So thermoregulation, it's on page 480. It's normal temperature body fluctuates several degrees during the day, response to physical activity, motions, ambient temperature variations. One of the things is oral temperature actually averages about 1 degree Fahrenheit less than rectal temp. And body, it also exhibits diurnal, day-night fluctuations. So lowest temp occurs when you sleep, and then higher temps when you are awake. Even when a person relaxes in bed, it's still higher than when sleeping. Thermoregulation. So when you have cold, what happens? You have vasoconstriction of the skin vessels, so the vessels get constricted. You have increased heat production by shivering, which increases epinephrine or adrenaline secretion, and thyroxine from the thalamus. Basically, you have your thyroid. The thyroid basically causes this thyroxine. Not thalamus. The thyroid gives this thyroxine increase as well. You have what else? You have, let me see. When you have heat, basically, if there's a heat loss, so if you have stimulated by heat to increase the heat loss, you have vasodilation, which is increasing the subcutaneous skin vessels, which causes sweating, which causes the red look on the face, on the arms, things like that. And then you have the decreased muscle tone and voluntary activity. And then again, in here you have decreased thyroxine. Like I said, thyroxine comes out from the thyroid, which basically increases metabolic rate, And so the thyroxine increases metabolic rate, so this is going to decrease metabolic rate and decrease the epinephrine secretion, which is adrenaline secretion. Because remember, adrenaline increases the fight or flight response, which increases blood pressure, increases temperature, things like that. And so when you're trying to decrease heat, the opposite happens. Thermal balance. So you have after heat transfer to periphery, you have regular. So the thermal balance functions after heat transfer to the periphery. You have regulation of evaporative cooling and then varying the rate of heat production. So you have what here. This is on page 480 as well. You have body heat content. What are the things that basically provide heat loss? What are the ones that provide heat gain? So heat gain, you have basal metabolic rate, metabolic activity, hormones, effects of food, increased heat gain, postural changes, environment, and then heat loss. You have the radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation. We're gonna talk about that. So body temp measurement, mean body temperature. T body represents the average of skin and internal temperatures. So you have the T body is the T core times 0.6 plus 0.4 times the skin, T skin. Mean skin temperature is T skinned, and it's the weighted average of the skin temperatures that reflect a portion of the body's surface at each site. So the hypothalamus basically is the controls coordinate the central coordinating center, okay, for temperature regulation, amongst other things in the brain. So it regulates temperature within a range of 37 degrees plus or minus degrees centigrade. The center plays the most important role in maintaining thermal balance. It's how is it activated? Well, by the skin. Okay, so there's receptors in the skin that give input to the hypothalamic control center that say, is it cold, is it hot? And temperature changes in the blood that perfuse hypothalamus that go across the hypothalamus stimulate this hypothalamic control center. So the blood flowing across the hypothalamus. No, oh yeah, this is what the showing that that there's a need for increase in heat or decrease in heat. Okay, so increase in these are the mechanisms basically that control the heat. And when it's too hot, what happens? Okay, the blood that flows across the hypothalamus gives this response that the hypothalamus comes in and says, okay, we need to increase the cold, or how do we increase the heat if it's too cold? Okay, so cold stress. Okay, you have three integrated factors regulate body temperature during cold exposure. You have vascular adjustments, you have vasoconstriction as vasodilation, muscular activity, okay, and hormonal output. When hormones are released, we talked about that before. That if we talked previously, if you have this thyroxine from the thyroid in this epinephrine release, basically it causes the heat to be produced. Okay, so hormones can cause heat to be produced. Okay, even. And the other is the effect too. A decrease in epinephrine or release and decrease in the thyroxine release basically causes the lack of heat. So like if there's too much heat stress, then what takes place? So you have this thermoregulatory mechanisms primarily protect against overheating. Four potential avenues for heat exchange when exercising: you have radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation. Okay, evaporation is a major physiological defense, but you also have radiation, which really objects emitting continually emit this electromagnetic heat wave. You have the sun. You see that has this radiant heat comes off the sun. Conduction is heat loss through solid, liquid, or gas. Okay, so you have that directly transfers heat from one molecule to another. Basically, you have this. So it would be like through warmer tissues to cool outer. So if the outer surface is cold, then the warmer tissue, heat will be transferred from the warmer tissue to the outer tissue. The conductive heat loss basically depends on two factors: the temperature gradient between the skin and surrounding surface, and their thermal qualities. So you have something like a hiker lying on a cold rock. Okay, causes that hiker then to become colder. Then you have convection, which is the currents of air next to the skin surface that carry heat away. That's important too as well. So you have this heat loss by conduction, depending on how rapidly The air near the body changes after warming. Okay, so if there's no air, okay, no air movement, convection, air next to the skin warms and acts as an insulation zone to minimize further conductive heat loss. So cold air around the body basically will cause heat loss. Okay, because the convective currents carry the heat away. And evaporation is so water vaporization for respiratory passages. Okay, you breathe out, and it becomes water vapor, and then also skin surface continually transfer heat to the environment. Okay. One of the things I want to mention is about 350 milliliters of water leaves the body daily through perspiration from the skin, by the way. And it's like a saline solution, so you have this, it's an NaCl, is what it is. So you're losing sodium in sweat. So this here just gives a picture of what that is. Solar radiation, you have thermal radiation from the sky, you have evaporation, sweat, you have skin or blood convection. So you lose convection, like we said, to what he's wearing. Then we have convection would be the skin going up. Convection is losing it to the air. Conduction is what is the material it's being transferred to. Okay, the heat or cold, and then also evaporation, which is the evaporating cooling that provides major physiological defense for overheating. And it's water vaporization is really what that is. Heat loss through high humidity. So you have sweat evaporation from skin. Depends on 3 factors. You have surface exposed to the environment, temperature and relative humidity of ambient air, relative humidity exerting the greatest impact on the effectiveness of evaporative heat loss, and then convective air currents around the body. Sweat doesn't cool the skin, rather skin cooling occurs when sweat evaporates. So sweat doesn't cool the skin, it's just when the sweat evaporates it cools the skin. Integration of heat dissipating mechanisms. You have circulation, which serves as the workhorse, the blood circulation. You have evaporation, sweating begins seconds after initiation of vigorous exercise, and then hormonal adjustments. Heat stress initiates hormonal adjustment to conserve electrolytes and fluid loss in sweat. Okay, because obviously you have to keep electrolytes are things that basically cause the heart to function properly and things like that. Okay, so this is, we don't want we talk about heat dissipating. We don't try to get rid of the heat and things like that. Cold weather effects of clothing on thermoregulation. You talk about cold weather, ideal garment blocks air movement, allows water vapor from sweating to escape. So water vapor escapes, but it will keep in the warmth. And then there's, on page 485, it talks a lot about that. So like the mesh of clothing in fiber can trap air, and it warms it to insulate from the cold. So you establish a barrier for heat loss because cloth and air both conduct heat poorly. A thicker zone of trapped air near the skin provides more effective insulation. So the ideal winter garment in cold, dry weather blocks air movement, also allows water vapor from sweating to escape. So some of these things, like the moisture wicking fabrics, are excellent insulators. Okay. And then you have warm weather clothing. Dry clothing, no matter how lightweight, retards heat exchange more than same clothing soaking wet. So it's okay if you have soaking wet, clothing, especially under football gear, because people sweat under football gear, and then they're, that's okay because even though you have this football gear preventing greatest barrier heat dissipation, but even if you're dry and you don't have wet clothes, it's not going to be any better. Exercise and heat, circulatory adjustments. So you have 2 competitive cardiovascular demands when exercising hot weather. You have oxygen delivery to active muscles increases. Then you have peripheral blood flow to the skin increases. Cardiac output remains similar during submaximal, but the stroke volume becomes smaller. So then the heart rate the heart rate goes up if the stroke volume becomes smaller, because cardiac output basically has to remain the same. Then max cardiac output, aerobic activity, max cardiac output and aerobic capacity decrease during exercise in the heat, because you have this compensatory release in the heart rate does not offset decreased stroke volume. So like we said, you have a stroke volume decrease, and then you have a heart rate increase, but just because you have a heart rate increase does not offset the loss of the decrease in stroke volume. So the cardiac output and the aerobic capacity do decrease during heat. Vascular constriction, dilation. Adequate skin and muscle blood flow during the heat stress occur at the expense of other tissues, temporarily compromise blood supply. So other tissues basically lose blood supply when you have this skin and muscle blood flow, whether it be kidneys or whatever else. Maintaining blood pressure, arterial blood pressure remains stable during exercise and heat, because visceral vasoconstriction increases total vascular resistance. And circulatory regulation, maintenance of muscle blood flow take precedence over temp regulation. So the circulatory regulation, the blood flow is the primary importance, even over temperature regulation. Then you have core temperature during exercise. So it can increase toward fever levels, but it's not a negative thing. And then within limits, it doesn't reflect the heat dissipation failure of like the fever, let's say. And then a modest core temperature increase reflects favorable internal adjustments that create optimal thermal environment for physiological metabolic functions. So the core increase is actually good for this type of exercise. For the exercise, so if you do this, it's not a negative. The core temperature increases. Water loss during heat. So for an acclimatized person, you have sweat loss peaking about 3 liters per hour during intense exercise in the heat, and the average is nearly 12 liters on a daily basis. Okay. You have this sweat gland fatigue that can impair core temperature regulation. If you're sweating for hours. And this hot, humid environment impedes effectiveness of evaporative cooling, promote large fluid loss. So one of the things in regards to this fluid loss, hot and humid environments it's very difficult to lose this lower temperature, because excessive sweat output and high humidity contributes little to cooling because of minimal evaporation. So that's one of the things that you have to think about. What how do you basically promote this large fluid? How do you promote fluid loss? Because it's difficult to lose fluid whenever you lose fluid in hot and humid environments, but the problem is that you're not lowering temperature. And this just talks about moderate activity on air temperature on the bottom, Fahrenheit, let's say 90 degrees. Moderate activity, you're losing 0.75 quart. Light activity, 0.4 quart, and the rest 1.1 quart. Consequences of dehydration. You have any degree of dehydration impairs physiological function and thermoregulation. Dehydration is, you decrease the electrolytes, it also disrupts the normal calcium, normal sodium potassium balances, which can cause arrhythmias and things like that with the heart, and it impairs physiological function, weakens muscles, impairs neurological function. So there's a lot of negatives in regards to this. And so any degree of dehydration impairs performance, okay? Because so we're talking about physiological function, thermoregulation is impaired due to dehydration. So you have to keep the water, okay, or Gatorade is good as well relative to electrolytes and glucose. So you have so this peripheral blood flow and sweating rate decrease to make thermoregulation more difficult. Premature fatigue occurs from reduced plasma volume that increases heart rate. Perception of effort and core temperature. Loss of plasma volume does the following. You have this increases in systemic vascular resistance, and then reduces skin blood flow. Okay, that's what the loss of plasma volume does. Consequences of dehydration, you have 7 factors: affect sweat loss, you have exercise intensity, duration, environmental temp, solar load, wind speed, relative humidity in clothing, water replacement, and rehydration. So adequate fluid replacement sustains evaporative cooling in acclimatized individuals. You need properly scheduling fluid replacement is a good thing to maintain plasma volume. So circulation, sweating progress optimally. So you should, if you're doing intense activity or in competition, you should be drinking water through it. Well-hydrated athlete always functions higher physiological performance than a dehydrated one. Exogenous glycerol use. So you have these people, they may be taking drinking the Gatorade with the glucose, or like these tablets that you see distance runners taking. And what happens is it helps in creating this state of hyperhydration. Okay, and the typical recommended pre-exercise glycerol dosage is 1 gram of glycerol per kilogram of body mass and 1 to 2 liters of water lasting up to 6 hours. And exogenous just means the supplemental. Factors affecting heat tolerance, you have acclimatization, so this repeated exposure to hot environments combined with exercise improves capacity for exercise with less discomfort during heat exercise. So obviously if you exercise in the heat, it's going to be better. Exercise training alone increases sweating response, sensitivity, and capacity. So sweat begins at a lower core temperature. Acclimatization response, you have this improved cutaneous blood flow. It transports metabolic heat from deep tissues to the body shell. You have this effective distribution of cardiac output, appropriate circulation to the skin and muscles to meet the demands of metabolic and metabolism and thermoregulation. Greater stability and blood pressure during exercise is the effect of this. Lowered threshold for start of sweating. Evaporative cooling begins in early exercise. You have more effective. You have this acclimatization response, which is more effective distribution of sweat over skin surface, and then the effect is optimum use of effective surface for evaporative cooling. You have increased sweat output, and then that basically leads to maximizing the evaporative cooling, lowered sweat salt concentration, dilutes sweat, and preserves electrolytes and cellular fluid. Age. Okay, so little age related effects of regulatory capacity or acclimatation to heat stress. You have older adults don't recover from dehydration really from reduced thirst drive. Prepubescent children show a lower sweating rate and higher core temperature during heat stress. So they increase their core temperature with heat stress, but then they don't sweat as well. So you have to really watch with kids. Children take longer to acclimatize the heat. Children exposed to environmental heat should exercise at a reduced intensity and receive additional time to acclimatize. Gender, men and women are equally tolerant in physiological thermal stress for exercise, mass for fitness, and acclimatization levels. Gender differences occur with following 4 thermoregulatory effects: mechanisms of sweating, evaporative versus circulatory cooling, body surface area mass ratio, and menstruation. You have excess body fat. Excess body fat negatively impacts exercise performance in hot environments. Fat-specific heat exceeds that of tissues and subsequently insulates the body's shell to retard heat conduction to the periphery. Large overfat persons possess a smaller body surface area to mass ratio for sweat evaporation compared with leaner, smaller persons, and excess body fat directly adds to energy expended in weight bearing activities. Okay, so yeah, it's not good. I mean, you have this fat that causes it's harder for if people are able they sweat more. Okay, they can't they're not able to get rid of they're not able to get rid of the heat as quickly, okay, because of this excess fat. They can't get to the skin, okay, to evaporate the sweat. There's more fat in the way, pretty much is what it is. Exercise in the cold. Human exposure to extreme cold produces considerable physiological and psychological challenges. Body loses heat about 2 to 4 times faster in cold water compared with air at the same temperature. And then metabolic heat generated by muscular activity contributes to thermoregulatory during cold stress. Thermoregulation during cold stress, okay? So that's why it helps exercise when you work out in the cold and you start and get warmed up. It basically it's a thermoregulatory effect. Has a thermoregulatory effect. Individual differences in body fat and content exert a considerable effect on physiological function in cold environment during rest and exercise. So individual differences matter as well. Right here, basically, it shows you have what happens during an increase in so pressure increases, barometric pressure as altitude increases. So you see, like here, it's pretty cool. You have Denver, Colorado, Mexico City, Leadville, Colorado. So what happens? Well, you have this oxygen dissociation curve, and that's over here on page 498. It just talks about how, so like for instance, you have lightheadedness and headache at A, which is around Denver. You have insomnia, nausea, vomiting, pulmonary discomfort, which is B, which is around Leadville, Colorado. You have dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, and GI disturbances, things like that. It's C, which is Morococha, Peru. But if you see Mount Everest, you basically have this hemoglobin saturation percentage, which is like less than 25%, which is meaning that if hemoglobin is not saturated with oxygen, it's not getting oxygen to tissues, which causes considerable hyperventilation and heart rate. So then you have people who, after 30 minutes up there, can faint, okay, without oxygen that's basically provided to them, oxygen mask and things like that up there. And so due to this, you have this saturation of oxygen that's decreased as you increase in elevation. And then you also have a PaO2, which is that's the changes in environmental physiological variables. That's the partial pressure of arterial oxygen, basically. Also, as you go up in elevation, you basically are losing you're losing this oxygen that's in your blood, okay, and the arterial oxygen is being lost. Climatization to cold. Humans adapt more successfully to chronic heat exposure than cold. Increased heat production does not accompany body heat loss, and individuals regulate lower core temperature in the cold. And then repeated cold exposure to the hands and feet bring about blood flow to increase to these areas during cold stress. So, you have this increased blood flow to the hands whenever have this, if your hands are cold at all times. Okay. So. And then you have this exercise at altitude. You have the density of air increases. The density of air decreases progressively and ascends above sea level. Percent oxygen decreases proportionally with the percent oxygen decreases proportionally to the degree to decrease the barometric pressure upon the ascent to higher elevations. So that's what we're talking about. You have the percent oxygen decreasing because you have this as you go up in higher elevations, and this is the decrease of barometric pressure, and then reduced percent oxygen accompanying arterial hypoxia precipitates immediately the immediate physiological adjustment to altitude and longer term process of acclimatization. So, this arterial hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen, occurs in the blood relative to higher altitudes and longer term process of acclimatization to the exercise. So what do you have? You have hyperventilation immediately. You have cardiovascular. You have submaximal heart rate. You have increased heart. You have increased. What ends up happening to in longer term is you have this hyperventilation that takes place. You're trying to breathe more quickly, which decreases the carbon dioxide. Then you have this your stroke volume lowers, so your heart rate increases. Okay, maximum cardiac output lowers because the stroke volume, even though your heart rate increases, the stroke volume still lowers, which then overall the cardiac output decreases. Hematologic, you have decreased plasma volume, increased hematocrit, which is RBCs, increased hemoglobin concentration, which is where the oxygen basically pairs with this hemoglobin to go to the tissues. Okay, then you have this localization effects with increased mitochondria, which that's where the Krebs cycle occurs. So you have this this mitochondria is what gives oxygen to the tissues, so that takes place. Anaerobic enzymes. Oxygen loading at altitude, inherent nature of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve dictates only a small change in hemoglobin's percentage saturation with decreasing PO2 percent oxygen until about 10,000 feet. So so you have this. There's not much of a change in dissociation of hemoglobin, oxygen with hemoglobin, until you get up to about 10,000 feet, and then you see it. So it's more difficult. It's much more difficult to work out after that. In transition from moderate to higher elevations, value for alveolar oxygen partial pressure exists on the steep part of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, reducing hemoglobin oxygenation. So this then dramatically and negatively impacts even moderate aerobic activities. So you have so when you get up there at the higher elevations, even if you're doing moderate activity, it's still you're going to be affected. Altitude acclimatization, the adaptive response in physiology and metabolism that improve tolerance to altitude hypoxia. The acclimatization adjustments occur progressively at each higher elevation. Full acclimatization requires time. Okay, so you have this immediate adjustment, which is hyperventilation. Like I said before, you're breathing quickly. Increased blood flow, cardiac output during rest, and then submaximal exercise. Fluid loss, okay, depressed thirst sensation, and altitude negatively affects fluid balance. So that's why another reason why you don't do as well up there in working out, because you have an decreased fluid loss, which, as we know, dehydration does not help in regards to exercise performance. Okay. You also have a decreased appetite and food intake during altitude, which is another thing. And obviously there's fluid in food, so that's another thing. The cold, dry air in mountainous regions causes considerable body water to evaporate as air warms and moistens respiratory passages. So cold air causes more expiration because there becomes more liquid molecules in your breath, breathing out, so that causes more evaporation, so it causes more fluid loss. And then the coldness basically causes water to evaporate off the skin, which isn't really seen as much because it's going from the water at the skin level to the dry air and the cool air. Respiratory fluid often leads to moderate dehydration and accompanying symptoms: dryness, lips, mouth, and throat. Long-term adjustments to altitude. You have three important long-term adjustments. Acid-base adjustment. Things become, like we said, more alkaline, 7 to 14 pH. That would be hematologic changes. Increase blood's oxygen carrying capacity, provides most important long-term adaptation. Initially, due to initial decrease in plasma volume, increase in erythrocytes, which are the things that cause which are RBCs, red blood cells, and hemoglobin synthesis. Remember those. So an increase in RBCs is what enables the oxygen then to get to the tissues, and hemoglobin is within this, which is that red protein iron that's made up of iron that has iron is a part of it that carries oxygen to the tissues. So if these are synthesized, it's helping in this oxygen to get to the tissues because of this altitude increase. And then cellular adaptations is another thing that we talked about, which was that which causes the body to adjust to the altitude. And then you have these altitude-related medical problems, acute mountain sickness, AMS, which is this benign condition. It becomes exacerbated by exercise first few hours of exposure. This is on page 500. Then you have HAPE, which is the pulmonary edema. High altitude pulmonary edema involves fluid accumulation, brain and lungs, requires immediate descent, lower altitude stretchers float to safety. High altitude cerebral edema, possibly fatal, develops within hours or days. People with AMS requires immediate descent, lower altitude supplemental oxygen. High altitude retinal hemorrhage in the macula of the eye, produces irreversible visual defects. Immediate descent to lower elevations, mandatory treatment, supplemental oxygen, use of hyperbaric chamber. That's on page 501. Then you have aerobic capacity. So what happens? Basically, you have a decline in aerobic capacity at the altitude of 589 meters, and thereafter, okay. The arterial desaturation increases by 79% per 1,000 meters, increased to 6,300 meters, where aerobic capacity declines more rapid nonlinear rate. So basically, aerobic capacity decreases as the altitude increases. Circulatory factors: reduced circulatory efficiency and moderate strenuous exercise offsets the benefits of acclimatization. Reduced max exercise blood flow results from the combined effect of decreased max heart rate and max stroke volume. Okay. So this just shows here that you have, as altitude increases, you have this percentage decline in VO2 max. So the capacity, aerobic capacity, which is basically to use oxygen to create ATP to continue to do work. Exercise capacity altitude continue. So we have no effect in regards to less than 2 minutes, which would be like that anaerobic workout, either the ATP, phosphocreatine system. So ATP is like that 1 rep max or vertical jump, and then phosphocreatine is like up to, like we talked about 12 seconds. Then you have from 12 seconds to up to about 2 minutes or 3 minutes, you have that glycolytic pathway, which is still anaerobic, so it doesn't really have any effect on that. Threshold for decrements in events lasting 2 to 5 minutes is about some of the longer term. After 2 to 5 minutes, there is a decrease in performance, and then after 20 minutes, there's even more so. Small improvements in endurance at altitudes during acclimatization related to minute pulmonary ventilation, increases in arterial oxygen saturation, and blended lactate response in exercise. Okay, so these are reasons based on acclimatization. And this just shows basically after the altitude increases, you have this decrease, and the race time basically increases. Okay, dependent on how long it is. So you see there from like 20 to 30 minutes, it takes you longer to complete the race. Okay, the time goes up as the altitude goes up. Okay, based if dependent on the time of the activity. So for 2 to 3 hour activity, your race time definitely takes longer to do it as compared to sea level. Altitude training at sea level performance. So sea level aerobic capacity generally doesn't improve after living at altitude. So there's no real if you go up and do altitude training, come back down, it's not going to help you at sea level. Hasn't been shown. Some physiological changes produced during Prolonged altitude exposure negate adaptations that could be improved during exercise performance. So actually, it's been seen to even do worse below. If you come from above, you think, oh, I train at low altitude, less oxygen, I'm able to do more at sea level. No, that's not hasn't been seen. Exposure to 2,300 meters and higher makes it nearly impossible for athletes to train same intensity at sea level. Live high, train low. There was a study on, basically it was on page 505. And it talks really about how if you lived at like 8,200 feet, but then returned regularly to train at 4,100 feet, if you went to run a race at 16,000 feet, you actually showed altitude acclimatization and better benefits. Okay, so if you live high, train low, you do show benefits if you then go back and race at a higher level. Gamow bag hyperbaric chamber. This is just a portable chamber treating altitude sickness by simulating lower altitudes. Person, so more oxygen, things like that. Person rests and sleep in the chamber. Reducing chamber's air pressure stimulates barometric pressure of given altitude. Reductions in barometric pressure bring about proportionate reductions in the inspired air's percent oxygen. Physiological agents to enhance exercise performance. You have this RBC reinfusion. This is the blood doping. Requires basically you withdrawing 1 to 4 units of person's blood. Plasma is removed, immediately reinfused, and the packed RBC is frozen in storage. And then reinfusion occurs 7 days before into competition. Increases hematocrit, hemoglobin levels by 8 to 20%. It increases hemoglobin concentration for men from 15 grams per deciliter to 19 grams. Research generally confirms physiological and performance improvements with RBC reinfusion. So there is a benefit from this. This just shows if you remove the blood autologously, meaning you're the same person's using their own RBCs, you remove it. It takes 6 weeks for that to go back, for them to regain what they lost. And then if you basically reinfuse that, then you raise that red RBC concentration above the baseline levels, which then causes this RBCs to translate and to about 5 to 13% increased aerobic capacity, reducing submaximal heart rate and blood lactate, improving endurance at sea level and high altitude. So there's the VO2 max increase from 5% to 13%. So this has been shown to work. And then this is what this is talking about, the pre-infusion, post-infusion difference. So you do see a hemoglobin increase of 27.5%. Remember, that's the blood-carrying protein. Hematocrit's RBCs, and then you have the terminal time. Look at the terminal time, okay? So it's, okay. You have this enhanced in performance, okay? Which is what takes place, okay? VO2 max increases, things like that, to ability to aerobic capacity and all that. Physiological agents to enhance exercise. You have hormonal blood boosting, so you have erythropoietin. This is the hormone produced in kidneys, stimulates bone marrow to increase RBC production. This is what we're talking about too with our Lance Armstrong, things like that. And why they took it is because the RBCs then, if you have increase in that in your blood, then it's carrying more oxygen to the tissues, so you're able to function longer. The tissues are able to continue to go before they are depleted of oxygen, which happens more quickly without the RBCs, high RBCs. Let me talk about what other things help. Talk about here about this 2 categories: general warm up, which is calisthenics, stretching, general body movements. You have this loosening activities that they're unrelated to specific neuromuscular actions of anticipated movements. Then you have specific warm-ups, which basically you have this skill rehearsal, like swinging a golf club before the real attempt, throwing a baseball or football before throwing a baseball or football for so that's the specific warm-up. And you have this breathing hyperoxic gas, which is another thing that's talked about. One of the things about warm-up physiological one of the things about warm up, I'm on page 509, talks about how like the following 5 physiological mechanisms suggest how warm up might improve subsequent performance. So warm up can increase the speed of contraction and relaxation of warmed muscles. It can, the viscous resistance within warm muscles is basically decreased, so that the viscous is more thickness. So basically, the warm muscles are less stiff. And then you have this facilitated oxygen utilization. That's the third thing that the warm up can help with. So basically, facilitative oxygen utilization by warm muscles, so that hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily at higher muscle temperatures. You have this facilitated nerve transmission and muscle metabolism at higher temperatures. So a specific warm-up facilitates motor unit recruitment. And then you have this increased blood flow through active tissues as local vascular beds dilate in response to increases metabolism, muscle temperature. So these are all the things that's on page 509. This whole hyperoxic gas, it works basically if you use it while you're working out. If you're not working, if you use it after you breathe hyperoxic gas, there is no benefit. Another thing too about this warm up I wanted to talk about, just because before I sign off here with the last couple slides, is that on page 509 it also talks about how the ECG, which is the electrocardiograph, reveals that the warm up actually helps in reducing these abnormalities. There's people who have ECG abnormalities. If they get on and start running at a moderate intensity, if there's a warm up before that, the response to this activity shows normal tracings rather than abnormal tracings if there's a warm up. So it does matter if there's a warm up in regards to this ECG tracing. So a warm up is beneficial. And it's also, the greatest benefit is actually for people with compromised myocardial oxygen supply. So the initial blood pressure doesn't spike as high either when you get into the activity if you have a proper warm up. So this just talks about the hyperoxic gas, and like I said before, oxygen-enriched gas mixtures used to enhance blood's oxygen carrying capacity, thus facilitating recovery prior exercise. Breathing hyperoxic gas during submaximal, maximal aerobic exercise enhances endurance performance. And that's just what this talks about here. You have, if they're using this hyperoxic gas, okay, during the activity, it's going to help in that you're going to have this aerobic differences in breathing. And so you have superior endurance, okay, measured by pedal revolutions each minute, breathing pure oxygen versus ambient air at sea level for A, and then B, of oxygen uptake curves during endurance rides show enhanced oxygen uptake while breathing pure oxygen. Okay, but that's the thing of it is are you really going to wear an oxygen mask while you're doing activity? Probably not. So it does show benefits, but it doesn't show benefits if you take it and then do a subsequent activity.